A flight attendant disrespected a black boy, but he didn't know the father, a Navy SEAL, was on board watching every move. What happened next stunned the entire cabin. He broke a black boy's jaw, thinking no one on board could stop him. He didn't realize the father watching silently was a Navy SEAL. Subscribe if you believe arrogance always meets unstoppable force. The pencil hits the floor with a soft tap and rolls beneath the seat, disappearing under the row ahead. Corinne Dallin immediately leans forward to retrieve it, his small fingers brushing the carpet as he stretches quietly, hoping not to disturb anyone. Before he can reach it, a polished black shoe kicks the pencil back toward him with deliberate force. It skids across the aisle and bumps against his sneaker. Corinne freezes, startled, his hand hovering mid-air. When he lifts his head, he finds flight attendant Reddick Vorn towering over him, his expression tight and irritated, as if the boy's simple mistake had personally offended him. "Watch your things," Reddick mutters, his voice sharp despite the calm cabin around them. His posture is rigid, shoulders locked, and his eyes follow Corinne with a strange intensity. Corinne whispers, "Sorry," his voice barely louder than a breath, but Reddick's gaze narrows as though the apology were an insult. The brief moment becomes heavier than it should be, drawing a few curious glances from nearby passengers, all male, all quiet, none willing to get involved. 2 rows back, Mason Dallin lifts his eyes from a magazine he's pretending to read. He recognizes the tone instantly, not loud, not aggressive, but carrying the edge of someone itching for a confrontation. His instincts sharpen, though his expression remains calm. Mason notes every detail: Reddick's stance, the tension in his jaw, and the way he leans too close to a child who has done nothing wrong. Mason doesn't move yet. His objective is to stay unnoticed, at least until a real threat appears. But inside, a cautious alertness begins to rise the way it always does when something is off. Corinne picks up the pencil slowly, holding it like it might break if he squeezes too hard. He tries to return to his sketch, the small drawing of a model helicopter his father once built for him, but his hands tremble slightly. The cabin lights glow softly, the steady hum of the aircraft filling the silence. He wants to forget the moment, focus on the lines and curves of the sketch, but he can feel Reddick still watching him. Reddick shifts closer, pretending to adjust something on the overhead, but even though nothing there belongs to him. The movement feels staged, calculated. "Kids always slow everything down," he says under his breath, loud enough for Corinne to hear, but soft enough to make it seem accidental. A man seated across the aisle frowns, glancing between the boy and the attendant, but he doesn't speak. The quiet tension threads through the mid-cabin like a thin wire. Corinne presses his sketchbook to his lap, trying to make himself smaller. He whispers another sorry, though he isn't sure what he's apologizing for now. Reddick steps closer, and the forced smile that spreads across his face feels wrong, too stretched, too hollow. It doesn't reach his eyes. His shadow falls over Corinne's seat, dimming the light on the page. Mason shifts in his seat again, the magazine lowering slightly as he watches. He maintains the posture of an ordinary traveler, but his mind is running through possibilities. Reddick's behavior doesn't match standard cabin routine. The man is agitated, on edge, reacting to minor things as if they're threats. Mason silently wonders whether this is stress, inexperience, or something deeper, something the airline should have known before assigning him to a full flight. Foreshadowing lurks in subtle moments. The way Reddick's fingers twitch at his side, the stiffness in his steps, the tension that seems to ripple off him even when he isn't speaking. Corinne senses it too. He doesn't understand it, but he feels the shift in the cabin atmosphere, a heaviness settling in the air, making every sound a little sharper, every movement a little slower. His sketching stalls, lines growing faint as his hand hesitates. Reddick bends down abruptly, bringing his face close to Corinne's, much closer than a stranger should. Corinne's breath catches. The attendant's eyes flick to the sketchbook, then back to the boy's face, studying him with a strange judgment that Corinne can't decipher. Mason straightens in his seat. His heart rate stays steady, but the readiness in his muscles tightens. He is 2 rows away, but he sees enough. He recognizes the moment before a storm begins, the quiet pressure before a line is crossed. Corinne tries to pull back, but he is already pressed against the seat. Reddick's forced smile widens, though his eyes remain cold, calculating. I hope you're not planning to be a problem today. Reddick Vorn stopped abruptly at row 14, his polished shoes thudding slightly against the cabin carpet. He leaned forward with a mechanical glare, scanning Corinne Dallin without warmth. The light turbulence outside gave the interior a mild rattle, but Reddick's expression looked like he was waiting for the smallest excuse to assert control. He focused on the quiet boy like he was inspecting a suspicious package rather than a passenger. Buckle check, he barked sharply. Corinne, startled by the tone, blinked and sat up straighter. It's already buckled, sir, he said, his voice barely audible above the hum of the engines. I said let me see it, Reddick insisted, voice sharp with accusation. Corinne hesitated for half a second before obediently lifting the hem of his hoodie, revealing the silver buckle secured tightly across his waist. It clicked softly when he tugged it to show there was no slack. Reddick didn't acknowledge the visual confirmation. Instead, he folded his arms, his lips curling into a sneer. Getting smart with me, are you? Corinne's eyes widened. No, sir, he said quickly, voice trembling. I was just what? Reddick cut in, leaning closer, enough that Corinne flinched back into the window seat. The overhead lights cast shadows across the man's face, giving his features a harsher edge. You think just because you mutter something politely, you're following the rules? 2 rows behind, Mason Dallin turned a page in his magazine, but his eyes weren't following the text. They were fixed on the reflection in the metal strip along the cabin wall. His posture shifted barely an inch forward. Trained instinct didn't need shouting or violence to recognize a problem. It could feel the imbalance in tone, the microaggression in proximity. And this wasn't the first time Mason had sensed something off. Reddick's hand suddenly darted out, not in aggression, but with the casual entitlement of someone claiming authority. He snatched the sketchbook off Corinne's tray table. The boy gasped softly, eyes darting to the other passengers, searching for help that wasn't coming. What's this? Military drawings? Reddick scoffed as he flipped through the pages with rough fingers. What are you trying to be, some kind of child soldier? They're helicopters, Corinne said, voice thin and uncertain. My dad builds them. Reddick's eyes flickered upward. Really? And where is this oh-so-important dad now? Left you to wander alone, did he? Mason didn't move. He didn't twitch, but his gaze locked onto Reddick like a laser. The insult passed over Corinne, but it slammed into Mason like a direct challenge. Still, he remained seated. His objective hadn't changed, protect without revealing. But the leash was growing tighter. Corinne extended a hand tentatively. Can I please have it back? Reddick stopped flipping. His nostrils flared for a reason no one understood. Something deep and unresolved surged behind his eyes. He slammed the sketchbook down onto the tray with a loud crack that made the passenger across the aisle jump. Do not talk to me like that, Reddick snapped. Corinne shrank into his seat, hands retreating to his lap. Around them, murmurs stirred like rising wind before a storm. A balding man 2 seats back furrowed his brow, glancing at the attendant call button, but not pressing it. Another young man farther down took out his phone, holding it low but unlocked, camera ready, just in case. Hey, a male passenger muttered from the middle row, take it easy. But Reddick ignored the comment completely. His voice dropped into a mockery of calm. If you can't follow my rules, he said slowly, stepping forward again, I'll make you follow them. The words floated through the cabin, heavier than the turbulence itself. Mason heard every syllable. He placed the magazine down in the seat next to him and leaned forward, spine straightening with deliberate restraint. His hand brushed the edge of the armrest, not gripping it, just grounding himself. He saw the shift in Reddick's stance, a subtle lean that brought him too close to the child's personal space. Behind the curtain, near the galley, another male flight attendant, Jaron Voss, noticed the unease. He whispered low to a colleague, barely audible, he shouldn't be near children this week. His colleague turned. What do you mean? Jaren glanced toward Corinne's row, then back. There was a report. Something for a couple days ago. Management didn't suspend him. Said they were short-staffed. The implication hung in the air. And as Reddick's shadow fell across the small boy's table once again, Mason rose half an inch from his seat before sitting back down just as quickly. Not yet. Not unless Corinne was in real danger. Reddick's jaw flexed, as if restraining something himself. His hand hovered at his belt, where a small, coiled zip tie holder was clipped. The kind meant for last resort security protocol, usually never needed, especially not for a child. But his fingers tapped it almost rhythmically. Passengers were watching now, some openly, some behind dark glasses or phone screens. Corinne didn't cry, didn't speak, but his shoulders curled inward. He understood something instinctively. This was no longer just about a seatbelt. Mason's fingertips rested on the top of the seat back ahead of him. His breathing slowed, controlled, ready. His mind was running through contingencies. If Reddick touched Corinne again, how to intervene without causing a chain reaction. How to subdue without harming. How to move fast without revealing his clearance. Reddick stepped forward again, his foot landing too close to Corinne's bag under the seat. Corinne's lips parted slightly. He looked up, eyes wide, confused, frightened. Reddick's voice dropped even lower, a hiss meant only for the boy. I said, if you can't follow my rules, I'll make you follow them. Mason quietly unclenched his jaw. The storm was forming. Reddick steps closer than necessary. The plane jolted hard. Corinne's small frame lurched forward in seat 14A, his body reacting to the sudden drop in altitude. It wasn't severe enough to trigger alarms, but enough to draw gasps and clutching hands across the cabin. His pencil rolled off the tray again, clattering to the floor. Before he could reach for it, a shadow loomed. Reddick Vorn arrived, lips curled in irritation. Still not sitting properly, he snapped, although Corinne hadn't moved from his seat since takeoff. Corinne blinked, startled, and tried to straighten even more. I am, he whispered, his voice tight with confusion and fear. Reddick didn't wait. Are you responsive? He muttered, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, as if speaking into some unseen report. Without warning, Reddick reached out and grabbed Corinne's jaw. It was meant to look like a check, justifiable even, but the grip tightened. Fingers dug in, just below the ear, clamping down with calculated pressure. Corinne winced, then whimpered. A soft but sickening crack followed. Corinne's eyes widened, his body stiffening. A high-pitched whine escaped his throat, immediately muffled as he instinctively clamped his lips shut. His jaw shifted, not subtly, but in a way that instinctively told every witness something was terribly wrong. Across the aisle, a suited man stood halfway up. Hey, what are you doing? Let go of the kid. Reddick turned to him with a glare so venomous, so absolute, that the man hesitated. His voice faltered, and he slowly sat back down. From 2 rows behind, Mason Dallin saw everything. He had seen many things overseas, crises unfolding in slow motion under chaos, but nothing made his pulse spike like what he'd just witnessed. He didn't leap up. He didn't rush. He stood calmly, but with intent. The transition from stillness to motion was subtle, yet surgical. Every breath calculated. Every angle judged. The cabin didn't notice him yet, but they felt it, a presence awakening. Reddick forced Corinne back into the seat roughly, pressing the tray up against the boy's knees. Corinne's body curled slightly, arms trembling, and then the sound came, a small, agonizing cry that pierced through the ambient drone of the engines. Mason began moving forward. Each step down the narrow aisle felt like a countdown. He didn't push, didn't shove, but his stride had momentum, unseen and unchallenged. Passengers, now recording on phones, murmured in growing discontent. Did you see that? He hurt that kid. He really hurt him. Flight attendant Jaren Voss had heard the cry. He emerged from the forward galley, stopping short when he saw the pale look on Corinne's face and the way Reddick was holding himself, rigid, defensive, already bracing for a fallout. What happened? Jaren asked, his voice low, uncertain. Reddick didn't look at him. Instead, he reached for his comm piece and radioed the cockpit. We have a miner being disruptive, he said, voice sharpened by fear masquerading as control. I recommend restraint protocol. Jaren's eyes widened. Wait, Reddick, no. Don't. But it was too late. The call had gone through. Mason stepped into view just as Corinne reached up with shaking hands to clutch the side of his face. His jaw, visibly swollen already, hung crooked. His lower lip trembled, but no sound came. His eyes, moist, terrified, flicked up and locked with Mason's. That was all Mason needed. He didn't speak immediately. He crouched beside Corinne, one knee down on the floor of the aisle, and gently placed a steadying hand on his son's shoulder. His touch was light, reverent even, but firm, an anchor in the chaos. Reddick turned then, finally acknowledging the man beside the boy. Sir, I need you to return to your seat. This is an active crew matter. Mason's voice cut through, low and quiet. He's my son. The world didn't shatter. It didn't need to. It simply shifted. Passengers, realizing the connection, inhaled as one. Jaren froze. Even Reddick faltered. Corinne didn't speak. He couldn't. But he leaned slightly into Mason's touch, grounding himself in the one person he trusted most in the world. A thread of blood lined his lip now. His breathing came in short, controlled sips. Mason looked up at Reddick, not with rage, not with fear, but with a calm intensity that suggested history, unspoken knowledge of what happened when men went too far. Reddick opened his mouth, perhaps to justify, to blame, to lie, but Mason didn't give him the chance. He leaned closer to Corinne, keeping his voice so soft that it barely carried beyond the nearest seats. I'm here now. Reddick's voice cuts through the cabin before anyone can breathe. He attacked me, he shouts, pointing at Corinne with a trembling hand that tries to look confident but falters under the weight of dozens of startled eyes. The cabin jolts with a ripple of disbelief. Mason steps into the row without hesitation, his movements calm but edged with urgency, like a tide pulling inward before a storm. What happened to my son? He asks, his voice low enough to steady the space around him, yet strong enough to command attention. His jaw tightens as he studies Corinne's face, pale, trembling, his jaw hanging at an unnatural angle that makes every breath look painful. Reddick bristles at Mason's calmness, mistaking it for submission. Your boy was refusing instructions, he snaps, raising his chin as though the lie might gain strength from height. His eyes dart quickly around the cabin, searching for someone to validate his story. But passengers shift uneasily, some whispering, others shaking their heads. The tension becomes thick enough to feel like a weight in the air, pressing on everyone except Reddick, who seems unaware of how quickly the truth is rising against him. Dramatic irony sharpens the moment. Mason looks like any tired traveler, not the man who has navigated chaos far more dangerous than air turbulence. Sir, please step back. Mason says, his tone steady, his posture relaxed but centered. To anyone trained to see it, his stance reveals readiness, control, and calm authority. To Reddick, blinded by anger and fear, it looks like defiance. Jaren approaches quietly, sweat beading at his hairline despite the cool cabin air. Reddick, he murmurs, almost pleading, you shouldn't be handling passengers today. His voice trembles with something deeper, a hidden truth waiting to surface. Mason catches the whisper, along with the dread behind it. It plants the first seed of a larger problem, something buried and dangerous, something that does not belong on a flight full of families. Corinne tries to speak, but the sound comes out broken, slurred by pain. His small fingers clutch the armrest as he tries to steady himself. Mason kneels instantly, placing one hand behind his son's neck and the other along the jawline with controlled precision. He doesn't need medical equipment to understand the damage. The fracture is obvious. The tremble in Corinne's lips. The way his teeth do not align. Mason's breath goes still for a moment. Passengers murmur again. The businessman across the aisle mutters, "That's not from a fall. He grabbed him." His words hit the cabin like a spark on dry leaves. Reddick steps forward, voice rising. "If he can't behave, I'll restrain him. Protocol allows it." His hand hovers near the restraints clipped at his side, and several passengers recoil as though witnessing a snake coil. The panic grows louder, sharper. Mason stands slowly, placing himself between Reddick and Corinne with a quiet, unwavering resolve. "You will not touch my son," he says, every syllable controlled. Reddick scoffs, raising his voice as he signals the cockpit again. "Cockpit, I need authorization to restrain an aggressive minor," he announces, deliberately twisting the truth. The radio crackles back with a confused acknowledgement. His attempt to frame himself as the victim only fuels the outrage brewing behind him. Someone from the back row speaks up, voice shaking with anger. "We saw everything. He didn't attack you." But fear makes Reddick reckless. "Step aside," he orders Mason, reaching toward Corinne again as though doubling down will somehow rewrite what everyone just witnessed. Mason moves before thought can form, instinct guiding every muscle. His hand rises, intercepting Reddick's arm midair with a gentle yet unyielding grip that freezes the entire cabin. Passengers inhale sharply. Reddick's eyes widen, startled by the effortless strength, by the precision that holds him without pain, yet leaves no room for escape. Mason's shoulders remain relaxed, his breathing steady, his gaze calm, too calm for a man in a simple father's role. Jaren's breath catches. He sees something in Mason he cannot name, but he knows it is something powerful. Reddick tries to pull his arm back, but finds himself anchored. "Let go," he demands, but the command lands hollow, swallowed by the heavy silence now blanketing the aisle. Corinne watches through watery eyes, sensing safety return in small waves. The boy says nothing, but his hand reaches subtly for his father's sleeve. Mason releases Reddick with the same precision he used to stop him. No aggression, no violence, just an undeniable message beneath the surface. This is a man who knows exactly what he is capable of. Reddick rubs his arm, his pride wounded more than anything else. He steps back, seething, looking around for support he no longer has. His voice cracks with frustration as he forces out the line that ends the moment and opens the door to the turning point that is coming. "Who do you think you are?" Mason stood still, his boots rooted like anchors to the cabin floor, as if the turbulence around him had nothing to do with the plane and everything to do with what was about to happen. His breath was measured, slow, calculated, controlled, each inhale reminding him not to act on impulse. Across from him, Reddick Vaughn's voice cut through the tension, smug and escalating. "Who do you think you are?" The question didn't need an answer. It echoed through the aircraft like a challenge hurled into the path of a storm. Instead of responding, Mason stepped forward, not fast, not threatening, but deliberate. One foot then the other. No noise, no fanfare, just presence. He placed himself between Reddick and Corinne, blocking the boy from the flight attendant's reach with a single, unflinching motion. No words, no raised voice, just the silent, immovable truth of a father standing guard. Passengers who had been frozen in discomfort now felt something shift. No one could name it, but it radiated from Mason like heat off coiled steel. There was no aggression in his body, but every line of him said, "Do not proceed." Reddick blinked, confused by the man's composure. He mistook Mason's stillness for compliance. "A mistake. You're obstructing a crew member's authority," Reddick barked, louder now, aware of eyes watching but not the weight behind them. He reached again, too close, too fast. Mason moved. A single hand shot forward, intercepting Reddick's wrist with unyielding precision. Not violent, not even harsh, just final. The reach stopped midair like it hit concrete. Mason held Reddick's wrist gently, but completely locked. His grip didn't tremble. His face remained calm. But the message was crystal clear. No further. Corinne's breathing became uneven, each breath a tremble that mirrored the sharp pain running through his fractured jaw. His eyes welled, more from confusion than fear. Mason turned slightly toward him, his free hand brushing against the boy's shoulder with a calm reassurance. "I've got you," he whispered. Behind them, a passenger in row 17, gray hair, wrinkled brow, leaned forward and muttered to no one in particular, "That stance looks military." The foreshadowing slipped into the air unnoticed by Reddick, but it tingled down the spines of those who heard it. Jaron Voss stepped forward cautiously, his face pale with nerves. "Reddick, stand down," he said, trying to bridge sanity with authority. Let's just de-escalate this." Reddick didn't blink. "He touched me first," he hissed. "I'm well within rights to restrain them both." Mason's eyes narrowed. "You're going to restrain a child with a fractured jaw?" Jaron snapped back, more courage in his voice than moments before. "I'll do what I have to do," Reddick replied. And then he did the unthinkable. He reached into his vest and pulled out a pair of black zip cuffs, plastic loops gleaming under the cabin lights. He held them up like a threat, waving them slightly for effect, as though anyone watching should recognize the authority he believed he had. Passengers gasped. A phone camera clicked. One man across the aisle began live streaming, holding his phone low but steady. Mason didn't move. Reddick glared. "I said sit down. You don't want to escalate this." But escalation had already occurred, and it wasn't Mason who caused it. Silence returned, sharp and expectant. Cabin pressure had nothing on the pressure in the air. Mason slowly raised his head. His voice, when it came, was steady, measured like everything else about him, but it landed like thunder across metal. "You're making a mistake you can't undo." Reddick's threat sliced through the pressurized air like a blade. "No one moves until I finish protocol," he barked, brandishing the restraints as if they were weapons. His voice trembled not with fear, but with a volatile mixture of panic and wounded ego. Rows of passengers, already shaken by turbulence and tension, now stood despite the seatbelt signs, their expressions ranging from fear to defiance. The hush before chaos had shattered. Mason didn't flinch. Cradling Corinne's injured jaw with a hand trained for battlefield triage, he shifted his weight slightly, barely noticeable, but surgical. His right foot angled subtly behind the left, anchoring him. The stance wasn't for show. It was a quiet declaration. If Reddick came any closer, it would be his final mistake. Jaron tried again, desperation leaking into his voice. "Reddick, put the cuffs away. This isn't protocol, it's escalation." His voice cracked under the weight of complicity. He wasn't just pleading for calm. He was pleading for redemption. But Reddick's eyes darted wildly. "You're undermining me," he snapped, turning on Jaron with the intensity of a cornered animal. "You know what happens when order collapses midair? I've read the manuals. This is my cabin. You lost this cabin the second you grabbed that boy's jaw." A passenger muttered near the back. Another one raised a phone higher. Recordings multiplied like witnesses in a courtroom. Mason ignored the noise. His focus narrowed. Corinne whimpered quietly, pain etched across his young face. Mason bent his knees slightly, stabilizing himself as the aircraft jolted again. The small movements, precise, economic, didn't register to most passengers. But one man near the emergency exit tilted toward his wife and whispered, "That guy, he's not normal. That's training. Serious training." Reddick blocked the aisle like a dam against a rising current. His face flushed with fury, veins surfacing on his neck. "You will return that child to his seat now," he demanded, stabbing a finger toward the row like a judge issuing a sentence. Mason's reply was movement. In a blur, Reddick lunged, arms wide, aiming to snatch Corinne from Mason's grasp. But Mason shifted half a step back, turned his torso, and caught Reddick's arm mid-swing. He didn't punch. He didn't twist. He simply redirected. A gentle downward roll of the wrist and elbow forced Reddick off balance without pain, without resistance. It was artful, silent, unforgiving. The cabin gasped in unison. Reddick stumbled sideways, confused, like he'd slipped on air. He blinked rapidly, unable to understand how his dominance had evaporated in a single, quiet move. His fingers twitched around the restraints still dangling from his grip. A pilot's voice broke through the intercom in a clipped tone. "Cabin crew, prepare for emergency restraint protocol. I repeat, prepare for diversion, landing per security escalation request." The words landed like stones. Passengers erupted into anxious chatter. Some grabbed for overhead compartments. A woman cried out. The smell of fear, the sharp, metallic tang of adrenaline, spread through the narrow fuselage. Mason clenched his jaw. The cockpit had believed Reddick's earlier call. That changed everything. Corinne whimpered again, the small sound piercing Mason's chest like shrapnel. It's okay, son. I've got you, Mason murmured, adjusting his grip and shielding Corinne's body from potential contact. The child's pain was now more than physical. It was surrounded by noise, movement, uncertainty. Behind them, Jaren stood straighter, eyes darting from Reddick to Mason. His breath hitched as he made a decision he should have made long ago. He stepped beside Mason, forming a quiet but unmistakable line in the sand. Back down, Reddick, Jaren said, voice low but clear. You've already gone too far. No one listens to me, Reddick hissed, his voice cracking into something shrill. He looked around for backup, cabin crew, cockpit, anyone. But no one moved. The silence confirmed it. He was alone. He screamed into his radio, I need backup. I've been assaulted. I'm initiating full protocol. No response. Mason stared into him, not blinking. He spoke now, not loud, not forceful, but with an authority deeper than volume. You've screamed enough. You've scared enough. Step aside before you force me to act. He smirked, confident his act would go unnoticed, unaware that every move, every angle, and every reaction had already been calculated by someone trained to protect at any cost. If you believe cruelty under a uniform always collapses when real skill intervenes, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. Reddick charged without warning. Zip cuffs in hand, eyes wide with desperation, he lunged across the narrow cabin aisle like a man trying to reclaim control over a reality already slipping from his grasp. But before the cuffs could come within reach of Corinne, Mason moved, smooth, fast, precise. One pivot, one step forward, one breath, and Reddick's arm was locked and twisted harmlessly behind his back. In the same motion, Mason pressed him, not violently but firmly, against the side bulkhead of the aircraft. The flight lurched slightly, but Mason's stance didn't falter. Passengers gasped. Several clapped quietly, relieved someone had intervened. But Mason wasn't seeking applause. His body was coiled, calm, focused entirely on the threat. One arm controlled Reddick's wrist. The other hovered protectively near his son, who clung tightly to his shirt with his good hand, his breath shallow from the pain. You assaulted me, Reddick barked, his voice shrill, bouncing off the overhead bins. You need to calm down, Jaren said as he approached cautiously, his voice low and shaken. He stood just out of reach, palms raised. You're making it worse. You're siding with him? Reddick twisted, trying to break free, but the angle was locked. He couldn't move. He bit me, Reddick shouted, eyes flaring as he pointed blindly toward Corinne with his free arm. The kid bit me, and that man ambushed me. You're lying. A man from row 16 stood and said flatly. His phone camera was still rolling. We all saw what you did. A chorus of affirming voices followed. Passengers, shaken but clear-eyed. Some shouted. Others muttered in disbelief. A few recorded from over their seats. The mood in the cabin shifted from confusion to grim clarity. Those cuffs aren't even standard issue, someone added. A younger man across the aisle squinted at Reddick's gear. Sir, he's hiding something. Reddick's eyes darted. His fingers fumbled near his vest pocket. Mason spotted the movement instantly. Reddick was reaching for the cabin crew radio, strapped to his vest, fingertips brushing against the button that could trigger a coded alert to airport authorities. If he succeeded, the plane would land under false pretenses, and Mason could be met by armed officers, all misled by Reddick's panicked narrative. Mason didn't allow it. With a subtle shift of pressure, he redirected Reddick's arm slightly higher, just enough to make pressing the button impossible without causing himself pain. He didn't shout. He didn't flinch. He simply removed the option from existence. The cabin was quiet again, but it was the eerie kind of silence, the type that filled rooms where things had gone far past repair. You don't know what you've done, Reddick hissed under his breath, eyes wet with frustration, fear, or fury. No one could tell anymore. Jaren moved closer, closer than he had been since the beginning. His voice trembled with a mix of shame and realization. They told us to ignore his complaints. They told us he was cleared. Mason's gaze cut toward him, unblinking. "Who?" Mason asked quietly, without turning his body. His hand didn't release. His focus didn't falter. Jaren swallowed hard. The supervisors. There were incidents. One with a family. One with a boy. All flagged. But they needed staff. Mason didn't speak for a moment. His jaw tensed. The weight of that admission, spoken in front of witnesses, shifted everything. The problem wasn't just Reddick. The problem was the system that kept letting Reddick back on the plane. "Unbelievable," someone whispered from the rear. "They put our kids in danger to fill a schedule." Reddick heard it too. He panicked. "You'll all regret this," he screamed, twisting wildly again, but his body was too restrained, his leverage gone. Another man stood in row 11. "I don't think you're walking off this plane the way you planned." Mason's voice stayed low, composed, but the finality in it silenced everyone. "You'll pay for this when they land this plane," Reddick yelled, spitting each word like a curse hurled into a storm. With Reddick Vorn pinned against the side bulkhead by an immovable grip, the entire cabin froze. The cries, the chaos, the arguments, all vanished into an eerie hush as if the entire aircraft had fallen into suspended silence. The only sound was the distant whine of the engines and the ragged breathing of Corinne Dallin, his small frame trembling in his father's arms. Mason lowered himself beside his son, one knee hitting the floor with precise control, his eyes scanning the boy's face with practiced speed. Corinne's jaw was still disjointed, visibly swollen, a clear discoloration spreading along the cheek. His lips trembled, but no words came. Mason brushed a knuckle against his forehead, a silent gesture of comfort as his other hand gently supported his chin. He was assessing breathing pattern, a movement consciousness. The father inside him reeled in pain. The soldier inside him processed every second like a mission. "Stay with me, buddy. You're doing great," Mason said quietly, his voice steady but edged with restrained emotion. Behind them, passengers watched, caught between fear and awe. Some were still filming, hands slightly trembling. Others simply stared at the boy, the father, and the flight attendant who had spiraled into this chaos. Reddick, though still pressed against the panel by Mason's locked arm, was breathing hard, his face flushed with confusion, humiliation, and panic. He didn't understand how everything had flipped so quickly. Just minutes ago, he was the authority in control. Now he was being held like a civilian detained mid-flight, and worse, no one was coming to his defense. Jaren Voss approached slowly, eyes flicking between the passengers and the tense trio by the window. "Is he okay?" Jaren asked, crouching slightly to meet Mason's eye. Mason didn't look up. Fractured mandible, possibly displaced. "He needs medical attention the moment we land." Jaren swallowed. "We will inform the cockpit." "No," Mason said flatly, glancing up. "They've only heard Reddick's version so far. You need to tell them exactly what's happened. All of it." Jaren hesitated. He looked down the aisle, then back toward the galley phone. He had a decision to make, his job or the truth. The weight of the moment showed in the way his shoulders dropped. He nodded and turned, walking toward the nearest handset. While Jaren dialed the cockpit, Mason rose to his full height, keeping himself between Reddick and Corinne. The boy remained seated, eyes glazed but tracking his father with unwavering trust. Mason wasn't just his protector now. He was his anchor in a moment that had spiraled beyond logic. Over the cabin speaker, static crackled. "This is the flight deck," came the voice of the co-pilot, clearly strained. "Can we get a situation update?" Flight attendant Vorn reported a passenger and minor becoming physically violent. Mason turned his head sharply toward Jaren, who had just lifted the phone to his ear again. "This is Voss," Jaren said, voice tense but composed. "I'm overriding that last report. The minor is injured. Passenger 14, it did nothing wrong. I repeat, this is not what we were told." A hush fell again. Even Reddick's panicked breathing slowed, his gaze whipping toward the handset like it might betray him further. That's when another voice broke the tension. "I have the whole thing on video. a man said from row 16. He stood slowly, raising his phone. Every second of it. The yelling, the sketchbook, the grab, everything. The shift was seismic. Reddick's head jerked toward the voice, his eyes darting wildly. That single confession had shattered whatever defense he thought he still had. He stammered something unintelligible, a protest or a plea, but the cabin wasn't listening to him anymore. Mason took a slow step forward, his eyes locked on Reddick's. The silence thickened. Every eye in the cabin followed him. Even the hum of the air vents seemed to recede. Does his file include prior complaints about minors? Mason asked, not looking away. Jaron turned from the handset. He froze. A long pause. Then he nodded. Soft murmurs rose across the rows, shocked, angry, disbelieving. Words like how and cover up floated through the air like embers looking for dry wood. The passengers' sympathy now morphed into outrage, their fear into collective judgment. Reddick suddenly exploded with words. You can't do this. I'll have you arrested for interference. You laid hands on a federal crew member, he spat, eyes wild, his voice cracking with desperation. Mason took one final step closer, and the tone of the cabin shifted again. It wasn't loud or theatrical. It wasn't a threat. It was control, contained, focused, deliberate. He moved like someone trained to stop problems before they started. Reddick, despite all his bluster, involuntarily leaned back. Mason's voice was barely audible above the engine drone. Only Reddick could hear it. His words came not with anger, but with that quiet weight that can end wars or start them. I didn't want you to find out who I am like this. Reddick froze mid-breath, startled not by Mason's words, but by the force behind them. The calm, quiet tone sliced through the noise of the cabin like a scalpel. Every passenger nearby felt it. A silence settled, not the comfortable kind, but the kind that comes just before something irreversible. Mason didn't move suddenly. He didn't need to. With the same control he used disarming explosives, he reached slowly inside the inner fold of his jacket. His fingertips brushed something firm, folded, leather-bound, the kind of item meant to be seen only when there's no other choice. Reddick's shoulders tensed. His voice cracked. Hey, don't try anything stupid. He backed up half a step, raising his empty hand as if Mason were reaching for a weapon. But Mason said nothing. He just drew the ID case into view, calm, deliberate, and certain. The surrounding passengers craned their necks. A businessman lifted his phone again. A college-age guy near the front lowered his headphones. A flight assistant froze mid-step. Mason flipped the case open. It wasn't a police badge. It wasn't civilian clearance. What gleamed under the faint glow of the overhead cabin lights was a federal classification emblem reserved for Tier 1 operatives, covert clearance, special operations insignia, an identity that didn't exist on most systems. To anyone trained, it spoke volumes. To everyone else, it was something they'd only heard about in documentaries. The reactions were instant. Gasps. A woman covered her mouth. A man 2 rows back said aloud, "Is that real?" The air around Reddick thickened. His arms dropped slightly, as if the strength had been siphoned out. "Your military?" Mason's eyes remained on him. "I've led extraction units in war zones safer than this cabin." Corinne stirred beside him, whimpering softly, still cradling his jaw. Mason instinctively glanced down, brushing a gentle hand across his son's back. His face softened only for the boy. Jaron stepped forward, breath catching as he studied the ID. His voice trembled. "You're that Mason Dallin?" Mason didn't answer. His eyes returned to Reddick with a calm that now read like a warning. He hadn't come here for recognition. He hadn't planned to reveal himself at all. But something had shifted the moment Reddick laid a hand on his son. The energy in the cabin tipped again. Several passengers, previously confused, now moved with clarity. A man offered Mason bottled water. Another passed a tissue for Corinne. The act wasn't out of pity, it was respect. Quiet, immediate, unanimous. Then came the twist. A younger man seated 3 rows ahead stood and turned slowly. "Sir, I know who you are." His voice quivered not with fear, but awe. "You de-escalated the Castron Ridge hostage standoff 2 years ago. I studied that operation in training. No casualties. They said it was impossible. Mason didn't react. He didn't need to. The silence behind him spoke for him. Jaren's radio crackled again. Cabin crew, report. What's your status? Is the miner restrained? Is the threat neutralized? The irony cut deep. Mason stepped forward, gripping the top of the seat in front of him with one hand. I'm requesting a priority landing, he said firmly. This boy, my son, needs immediate medical care. Any delay is negligence. No jitting, no theatrics, just authority wrapped in steel resolve. Jaren didn't hesitate. He nodded, stepping away to answer the cockpit with trembling fingers. Reddick, meanwhile, remained frozen, his lips twitching uselessly. The man he had tried to dominate wasn't just stronger, he was a tier above anyone he had ever met. The zip cuffs in Reddick's pocket now felt absurd, his threats meaningless. His mouth opened as if to form a defense, but nothing coherent came out. Passengers stared, waiting to see if Mason would say anything else. He didn't speak to the crowd. His gaze never left Reddick. With a soft snap, Mason shut the ID case. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply said, "This ends the moment we land." The landing gear slammed down with a mechanical roar, the cabin rattling as the descent accelerated. Mason Dallin didn't flinch. His left arm cradled Corinne, holding the boy tight against his chest, absorbing the turbulence as the aircraft dropped toward the tarmac below. Corinne's breath came in shallow, stuttering pulls, each one edged with pain. Mason felt them through the child's ribs, a father's barometer for suffering. His eyes locked forward, scanning the path to the door, already anticipating resistance. Behind them, the cabin had shifted into a strained quiet. The earlier chaos had receded into a fog of stunned passengers whispering, recording, and watching as the man who had revealed nothing about himself until now took quiet control of the situation. A few rows back, Reddick Vorn sat restrained, sweating and fuming, his wrists bound with makeshift cuffs, his words clipped into shallow mutters. He still believed there might be a way out. Mason knew better. "Hold on, Corinne," Mason whispered, pressing his palm gently along the boy's back. "We're almost there." Corinne gave the faintest nod, his small fingers clutching the sleeve of Mason's shirt like an anchor. The child's jaw was badly swollen, his skin pale with the haze of pain. The angle of the brake had worsened during descent. Jaren Voss, the young attendant who had switched sides, leaned in from the jump seat near the galley. His voice shook. The captain said emergency crews are standing by. They'll open the forward door first." Mason nodded without looking. "Good. Make sure they know the child needs immediate medical transport." Jaren swallowed hard, glancing toward the cockpit. I think the airline is still planning to defend him. Reddick, they're saying it's protocol, that he acted in response to a threatening child." Mason's jaw tightened. "Keep every passenger recording. If anyone tries to delete footage, stop them." Jaren hesitated, then gave a quick nod and turned back down the aisle, whispering orders to a few passengers. Reddick, hearing this, jolted in his seat. "This is all twisted. You've turned them against me. I followed the rules." Mason turned his head, just enough for Reddick to see the cold precision in his eyes. "You broke the rules. Then you lied to cover it." Before Reddick could respond, a voice spoke from the rear of the plane. "I can confirm that," the man said as he stood. He was tall, clean-shaven, in his late 40s. He wore a plain jacket and no identifying badge, until he flipped it open. "Cohin Valley, Federal Air Marshal. I was aboard off-duty. I saw everything." Murmurs rippled across the cabin like a wave hitting shore. Even the most skeptical passengers gasped. Reddick's face drained of color. "You were ordered to stay silent." Reddick spat, eyes wide. "I was ordered to observe," Corin replied, stepping forward. "But that order ended when you fractured a child's jaw and lied to the cockpit." Mason shifted slightly, recentering Corinne as the landing announcement echoed overhead. The captain's voice was tight, clipped. "Meridian 417 preparing for emergency landing. Medical personnel are waiting at Gate C. All passengers remain seated until instructed." The plane's wheels struck the runway hard, the impact thudding through everyone's bones. Mason didn't react. His knees bent slightly, absorbing the shock to keep Karen stable. Emergency lights flashed outside as vehicles began trailing the aircraft. Reddick tried again, voice rising in panic. "You're conspiring against me. You're all... This is a setup." "No," Mason said quietly. "This is justice catching up." As the plane rolled toward its stop, Jaren returned, holding out a radio. "The captain wants confirmation. Are we clear to open forward access?" Mason took the radio calmly. "This is Chief Petty Officer Mason Dallin. Confirm priority medical evacuation for an injured minor. Passenger in 14A. Confirm that local law enforcement is ready to receive a restrained crew member for immediate investigation." A long silence followed. "Then confirmed, sir. Gate crew is prepped. Opening forward door." The cabin hissed as hydraulics engaged, and the front door swung open. Cool air swept inside, mixing with the sterile scent of adrenaline and fuel. Two paramedics bounded up the ramp with a stretcher. Mason met them halfway, carefully transferring Karen to the waiting cot. One medic took vitals while the other gently secured the boy's neck and jaw. Karen whimpered but didn't cry. Mason straightened and turned toward Reddick, who was now trying to slip out of the restraint under Corin's eye. "You're not walking out of this," Mason said. "I didn't mean to hurt him." Reddick stammered. "I was under pressure." "It's not what it looks like, no," Mason interrupted. "It's exactly what it looks like." Corin nodded toward the ramp. "I'll escort him. You go with your son." Mason moved toward the stretcher, pausing only once. He turned his full attention to the man who had tried to assert power through cruelty, now trembling under fluorescent lights, surrounded by people he could no longer manipulate. His voice was low, unwavering, edged with finality. He looks at Reddick and says, "Face the consequences with the same courage you lacked today." The cabin door slid open with a sudden whoosh, and the heat of urgency poured in behind the emergency medics as they climbed aboard in practice formation. Their uniforms were clean but already gloved, their expressions focused. Mason Dallin didn't hesitate. Cradling Karen in his arms like a wounded soldier, he stepped forward and gently transferred his son into the waiting arms of the lead medic. His grip was firm but not frantic. He had done this before countless times in different uniforms on different continents. But this time it wasn't a teammate. It was his son. "He's got a compromised mandible," Mason said with low precision. "Minimal blood, airway intact, pain response high." One medic gave a tight nod. Another checked Karen's pulse, and a third gestured toward the aisle. "We're taking him straight to ground-level transport. You can follow." But before Mason could move, a wall of Navy-clad airport security began forming around him, for men closing in fast, one already speaking into a handheld radio. "Sir, we need you to stay exactly where you are." Mason turned slowly, his hands still open from the handoff. His gaze met the lead guard's eyes, and for a moment, he didn't speak. The tension thickened like cabin air just before descent. "What's your charge?" Mason asked, voice level. The lead guard blinked. "You've been reported for interference with a flight attendant," and he checked a small screen, possible passenger assault. A bitter wave of dramatic irony surged through the watching passengers. Murmurs rose. A teenager in a hoodie shook his head. "They're trying to arrest the guy who just saved a kid." Before security could act further, a new voice cut through the noise like a razor across silk. "Stand down. That man is not your suspect." Corin Vale stepped forward, removing his blazer and flashing a badge none of the security officers had been expecting. "Federal Sky Marshal. I witnessed the incident firsthand. He restrained a violent crew member who injured a minor. I'll be filing a full report with timestamps and corroboration." Confusion sparked and then died just as quickly. The guards dropped their stances, glancing around at the growing number of passengers holding up their phones, each capturing the aftermath in shaky but undeniable clarity. Then came a new threat, slipperier, quieter. From behind a row of first-class seats, a sharply dressed man in a tailored vest stepped into view. His lanyard badge identified him as Roland Creed, Senior Operational Liaison for Meridian Air. His words were buttered with bureaucracy. "Gentlemen, I believe this was all a misunderstanding. Officer Vorn, our flight attendant, acted under considerable duress. We'll take it from here and ensure this is handled through proper internal channels." He gestured calmly toward Reddick, who was now sitting handcuffed near the galley, cheeks blotched with confusion and panic, his uniform disheveled. Reddick looked up hopefully, like a man being offered a quiet exit before consequences caught up. But Mason stepped into Creed's path before the man could take another step. His posture was unshaken, boots planted wide with natural authority. "Your airline endangered my son by ignoring warnings about this man," Mason said, eyes cold. Creed's smile faltered. "Sir, I understand you're upset." "Upset?" Mason's voice was quiet, not loud, but it cut deeper than a shout. "He fractured my son's jaw. I warned him twice not to touch the boy again. He tried to restrain a child, then lied about it." Creed tried to pivot again, but the atmosphere was no longer his to control. Another figure stepped into the corridor, Jaron Voss, the junior flight attendant who had watched the events unfold with increasing dread. His hands trembled, but his voice did not waver. "They knew," Jaron said. "They knew he shouldn't be flying. There were multiple complaints. At least 2 involved minors. Management buried them because we were short on crew." The words hit the cabin like a slap. Phones turned toward Jaron now, capturing every syllable. "Do you have proof?" asked the lead investigator who had arrived with Corin, his ID now visible from shoulder holster. Jaron nodded. "Yes. Filed. Time-stamped. I was told not to push it." The pieces began to lock in place. Foreshadowing from earlier whispers now turned to hard reality, an institutional failure hidden in plain sight. Security detail shifted their attention from Mason to Creed and Reddick, their body language turning from containment to inquiry. Outside the aircraft door, the ambulance engine revved, signaling that Corinne was ready to be transported. One of the medics motioned to Mason. "We're rolling out, sir." Mason gave a curt nod, started down the aisle, then stopped. He turned, eyes locking with Reddick, whose shoulders now curled inward like a crumpled uniform. There was no defiance in his face anymore, only disbelief and unraveling fear. Everyone in the cabin watched as Mason stepped closer, enough for Reddick to hear, but not enough to touch. "You broke the wrong boy today." The double doors to the operating area swung shut behind the stretcher, and Mason stood motionless in the corridor, jaw clenched, arms crossed so tightly over his chest they ached. The buzz of overhead lights and distant beeping monitors was all he heard now. Corinne was inside, under sedation, while doctors worked to stabilize the fracture that had shifted his lower jaw into misalignment. Mason's gaze was locked on the small window in the operating room door, though he could see nothing through it, only the reflection of a man trained to face war, now holding the weight of fatherhood in absolute silence. The hallway outside Valor Medical Center's trauma wing was cool, sterile, too calm for the storm boiling inside him. A low murmur broke the stillness. 2 investigators from the Department of Aviation Conduct approached, suits wrinkled from long hours and red binders under their arms. One of them, Agent Darvin Kell, nodded stiffly. "Chief Dallin, I'm sorry we're meeting under these circumstances." Mason's eyes didn't move from the door. He's not Chief Dallin right now. He's a father whose son is in surgery. His voice was low, deliberate, but sharp enough to cut glass. The other investigator, Brennan Morvan, cleared his throat. The airline released a public statement. It's already circulating. They're calling it a minor cabin misunderstanding, and they're avoiding naming anyone. No admission. No apology. Mason turned slowly, his face expressionless, but his eyes lethal. "You mean they're managing their liability? Quel shifty donizuri. We've seen this before. There's pressure on internal regulators, operational priorities, staffing shortages. Sometimes misconduct is documented but buried." Dramatic irony clenched the moment like a vice. These men knew. They had seen this pattern. They just hadn't expected the abused child's father to be someone who once planned military hostage rescues in civilian zones. Mason stepped toward them, not aggressively, but with the kind of unspoken weight that made even seasoned investigators hold their breath. How many times was Reddick protected? Mason asked quietly. Before either could respond, a pair of hurried footsteps echoed down the corridor. Jaron Voss appeared, wringing a folded file between his hands. His face was pale, like someone who had finally decided to speak after years of being silent. "Sir, I have something you need to see." Mason nodded once. Jaron handed over the file with trembling fingers. "This is from a month ago. Reddick grabbed a passenger's child. Off duty, technically. The family filed a complaint, but the airline's legal team sealed it. Said he was going through personal rehabilitation and that they needed to give him another chance." The twist hit like a knife through cloth, evidence of a buried danger, and now that silence had broken Corinne's jaw. Mason flipped through the memo, eyes scanning every stamped page. His breathing didn't change, but the air around him did. "You'll testify?" Mason asked. Jaron nodded. "I'll do it. I'll tell everything. Just make sure they can't make this disappear." Mason held the file a moment longer, then handed it to Kel. "This doesn't disappear." A soft click interrupted them. One of the double doors opened. A young male surgeon stepped out, pulling his mask down. His tone was professional but kind. "Mr. Dallin, your son's going to be okay. The fracture was clean. We've wired the jaw for stabilization. He'll need a few weeks of healing. Minimal scarring. He's strong." Mason let out a breath, deep and silent, as if exhaling a weight that had been pressing since the moment he heard Corinne cry. "Can I see him?" The surgeon nodded. "He's still waking up, but yes." The next room was dim and quiet, lit only by the monitor lights blinking steadily above the hospital bed. Corinne's face was swollen along the jawline, a stabilizer strap gently holding in place. Mason stepped in and sat beside him, the rest of the world disappearing. He didn't speak at first. He just brushed Corinne's hair from his forehead the way he had when the boy was younger, softer, before deployments and secret flights, and this cruel fracture in both their lives. Corinne stirred lightly, trying to talk, but Mason placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Don't talk, son. Just rest." The door clicked again. A nurse passed Mason a folded note. It was a message from Cornvale. For simple lines, Federal Oversight Unit activated. Multiple agencies converging. You did the right thing. We'll protect the evidence. Mason folded it once and slid it into his pocket without a word. He looked down at his son again, watching the small, rising breaths. There was no anger left in his face, only resolve carved in stone. The fight had just begun, and it would not stop with justice for Corinne. His voice was low when he finally spoke, almost like a vow. He squeezes Corinne's hand and says, "This won't happen to another child again." The chamber echoed with quiet murmurs as Mason Dallin stepped forward, the tribunal's crest behind him glowing under recessed lighting. Cameras clicked. Judges from the National Aviation Tribunal of Arion District sat in a crescent formation above, flanked by 2 federal ethics monitors and a procedural clerk. Mason's boots touched the center seal of the floor, a symbol of public trust scorched too many times before. He didn't pause. His right hand held a thick folder. His left hand stayed steady by his side. "The evidence," he said, his voice firm but composed, "is complete." He placed the folder on the polished dais, the weight of the contents felt by more than gravity. Inside were passenger testimonies, time-stamped recordings, the emergency cockpit log, and the sealed memo from Jaron Voss. Corin Vale sat nearby, his federal badge clipped neatly over his lapel, nodding silently as Mason detailed the sequence of events, each step precise, each fact irrefutable. The tribunal room held its breath when Mason turned slightly, pointing to a projected screen, now showing the redacted misconduct file of Reddick Vorn. 12 entries, Mason said quietly. 12. A stunned gasp traveled through the rows of attendees. Media, legal observers, passenger rights activists, airline reps. On screen, the timeline of each complaint glowed with damning clarity. One involved a crying child shaken by Reddick's outburst. Another, a bruised wrist on a teenager. All sealed, archived, ignored. The lead tribunal officer, Marshal Rendaver, leaned forward. "Are you telling us this man was repeatedly cleared for duty?" Mason's eyes didn't flinch. Not cleared. Protected. Outside the room, reporters whispered into microphones. Inside, Mason advanced his final objective. Not revenge, not exposure, but structural correction. If Corinne hadn't cried out in pain when he did, if passengers hadn't stood, if Jaron hadn't spoken up, my son's injury would have been buried. Like the rest, a screen behind him displayed a blurry still. Corinne clutching his jaw, Mason's body angled protectively, Reddick's cuffs midair. The emotional weight tightened. One tribunal member removed his glasses, visibly shaken. Mr. Dallin, Daver asked, what outcome do you seek from this tribunal? Mason's voice lowered. A system that treats every child like they matter before they're broken. The twist came minutes later, when tribunal analysts confirmed through metadata forensics that 2 supervisors had marked Reddick safe for reassignment, just one day after a report warning he posed a danger to minors. Staffing shortages, legal risks, image control. Who signed off on it? Another officer demanded. 3 executives from Meridian's Crew Oversight Division. The clerk answered, reading the names aloud. Executives, now present in the chamber. The very ones who once praised Mason's restraint, now found their own roles under review. Dramatic irony surged. They had thanked the man who unknowingly exposed their negligence. Mason didn't gloat. He only turned slightly and said, you knew he wasn't safe. You gambled with my son. Reddick's formal dismissal was signed into order by the tribunal within the hour. He would never work in aviation again and now faced criminal charges for endangering a minor. Outside, the press surged toward the closing statement. Mason refused microphones. He spoke only when asked about public praise. I'm not here for applause, he replied. I'm here to protect families. That afternoon, the tribunal announced the formal implementation of a new national standard, one modeled directly after the Dallin case. The Dallin Passenger Safety Protocol would now mandate immediate grounding and investigation of any flight crew accused of misconduct toward minors. No more delays. No more sealed files. Reporters gathered on the marble steps of the tribunal building. Among them stood Corinne, finally recovered, a protective brace still circling his jaw. He held his father's hand firmly. His eyes were calm, but not fragile. Strong. Mason placed his hand on Corinne's shoulder as cameras flashed. The boy straightened his posture. For the first time in months, he didn't feel like a victim. He felt like someone who had done something bigger than himself. As they turned to leave the steps behind them, Mason bent slightly and spoke just loud enough for his son to hear, his voice carrying into the final frames of the day's coverage. Your strength changed the skies for everyone. He struck the child and froze as the father stepped in, calm but lethal, ensuring the attacker faced immediate consequences. If you believe true authority protects the innocent without warning, subscribe now, because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights abuse of authority, prejudice, and the power of vigilance and accountability in confronting wrongdoing. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, justice, and protecting every family with dignity and respect.